What is the most surprising background of someone you thought you knew? I have a friend who has a huge scar on his face, like a straight line from his eye to his jaw, and it seems like it wasn't stitched and just healed with a significant gap. No one wanted to ask how he got it, as it was a bit rude, and most people assumed it was from an accident or something stupid when he was a kid. When I got to know him better and we had a quiet moment, I asked him, and the story was quite shocking. His ex-girlfriend hit him with an axe directly in the face. Not with enough force to kill him obviously, but it broke his eye socket and jaw. The wound had to be kept open because rust got into the wound. He left her unconscious and tied her up until the police arrived. I had never before met someone with such a violent story to tell. A guy I'm close to was a heavy drug user in his youth. I suppose meth and but I didn't ask for specific details. I don't know the whole story, but it was shocking when I found out. Now he's a fairly stereotypical suburban dad. Another guy I know constantly told obviously exaggerated stories about his life, from participating in a violent overthrow of his country's government, to faking his own death to escape mobsters, being an underground street fighter, to being embedded with the US Navy SEALs. What was surprising was going to his house and seeing photos, newspaper clippings, and other memorabilia basically confirming everything he told me. I worked with a guy whom I considered a friend. I worked on the East Coast and he on the West, but we often had joint projects. We traveled together to client meetings, had beers, went to games, etc. I even went to his wedding. One day the FBI shows up at my door asking for him. Without going into too much detail, before I knew him he was running an extortion racket with his then-girlfriend. They would target wealthy men, she would seduce them, they'd film it, and then extort the victim. He's currently in federal prison. I knew this guy from my small hometown. He had a mental disability that prevented him from functioning fully. He would go around collecting bottles from trash cans and then exchange them for money at the shelter where he stayed. He was just an incredibly kind person. He even did a lot of the cleaning and maintenance tasks around the place. I was told he always felt guilty for not having to pay to live there and wanted to earn his keep, so he did whatever he could to do so. Turns out he was a multimillionaire. His parents were extremely wealthy, and when they died they left everything to him, but he couldn't grasp what that meant. All he knew was that the kind people at the shelter were helping him, so he helped them in return. My first job was with an older Mexican man. He was super laid back and took me under his wing because I reminded him of one of his sons. One of the kindest guys I've had the pleasure of knowing. Turns out the guy used to be in a Chicano gang when he was younger, and he told me a few times he had killed people and spent quite some time in prison. I lost touch with him when I moved to another city, but I ran into him a few years later and he had become sort of a local real estate mogul, owning many bars and clubs in my hometown. I never asked him how that happened because honestly, I was too scared to ask.
Not me, but my partner did some work for this really nice guy who loved hunting but didn't have a gun license or guns, in New Zealand, which seemed odd. Turns out, a long time ago, his ex-wife was being beaten by her new partner and she called him for help, so he went and shot the guy in the chest with a shotgun and killed him. He spent some time in prison, and when he was released, obviously his gun license was revoked, and he wasn't allowed to handle firearms. Apparently, he was very open and honest about the whole thing, not bragging about it, but happy to answer questions.
After my mom's aunt and uncle died, their kids, the cousins, started coming to our family gatherings because they didn't have much other family left. I was in my 30s at the time and had barely heard of these people before they started showing up at our parties. They seemed like normal, middle-aged folks. One of the sisters was single, very quiet, and loved cats. She started declining into early-onset dementia and passed away. As we discussed her funeral, someone mentioned maybe we could display some of her art at the funeral. I was picturing typical amateur paintings or something. Then someone said, "I wonder if we should contact someone from the museum." "What museum?" "Oh, just the very famous museum that had several of her works in their permanent collection. Her avant-garde and strange video art. Very weird but creative stuff. She was an artistic genius." A curator from the museum ended up coming to her celebration of life and talked about her art. They even showed us some digitized works so they could be viewed using modern formats. I'm so sorry I didn't know this about her before she passed away. All the older family members knew, they just never thought to mention it. I guess to them, it was old news. My best friend's dad was an inspector in the police department. Basically, he led all the drug busts and such. We're not talking small-time arrests. We're talking big arrests where the DEA would be involved. I always thought they had an upper-middle-class lifestyle living off a single-family income. His mom didn't work. Turns out, his dad and his partner would go to a drug bust as usual, but if there was, say, $250,000 in cash in the house, they would only report $125,000 and the rest would go into their pockets. And of course, he knew how to launder the money and get it into the bank without raising suspicions. I guess it went on for like a decade before the department got suspicious and set up a sting where they had $200,000 in a closet. They put mics in the room and saw how much they took and reported was in the room. They reported they found $91,500 of the $200,000 planted. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison but got out after a year and a half. He was one of the nicest guys you could ever hope to meet, so it was shocking to know he was stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars. Edit. I talked to my friend about this. It was $13,500 in a hotel sting set up by the FBI. They took a little over $6,000 of that. All the bills were marked. The cameras and audio were planted by the FBI. That's what brought them down. It's not really surprising because I already knew it, but it was a surreal experience seeing it for the first time. My dad and uncle made a public access TV show in the 80s. It was a show of sketches/unrelated short stories, but I never got to see them until recently when my uncle digitized the Betamax tapes. It's very unusual for someone my age to see extended footage of video of my parents and their friends when they were young adults. Now they're mostly retired. These are the same people I've known my whole life, but in a different era of their lives that I really only knew about from the stories they told me. I was surprised to realize how much my dad resembled me at my current age. Same mannerisms, personality, sense of humor, receding hairline, etc. The stories were very similar to how I would have written them. I was being harassed and followed by the parents of a kid who was in the marching band with my daughter. The mother was one of those people who boasted about her mental illness and how proud she was of not being medicated. There came a point where I found them parked next to my car at the mall. I had a very recognizable car at the time with a personalized plate. There was no doubt it was my car, and in other places. I finally called the police when they cyberstalked my younger son. The police told them to stay away. That was it. I was literally on my computer researching lawyers to sue them when my husband called me and told me to turn on the news. The breaking news was that the husband had embezzled over $1 million from his church. She was arrested with him for spending the money. We knew they were crazy, but we never saw that coming. The problem resolved itself. When I was young, my grandmother said she had a standard desk job for the federal government for most of her career. Later I found out she was actually a CIA agent who may or may not have been very good with a gun.
My grandma's first husband died in Vietnam or Korea. I always knew this, but it wasn't until my aunt visited recently that I found out he died when my aunt was 3 months old. So my grandma, a widow with a baby in the 60s, went to the University of Colorado to get her master's degree to support herself and her new baby. I have her master's degree hanging on my wall to remind me that if she could do it, I can too. I met a girl in college who was beautiful and wore a very flimsy and worn-out t-shirt that was 3 sizes too small. Half the class was staring at her, but she seemed completely oblivious. Turns out her parents were super religious. She was homeschooled and then sent to some program that was supposed to eventually train her to be a nun. Her parents had been planning for her to become a nun since she was a child. She begged and pleaded to be allowed to take a semester of regular classes in college. Her parents finally agreed. Of course, she still had to live at home and wasn't allowed out after dark. The tiny t-shirt she was wearing had fit her since she was 14. Her family was extremely poor, and she had a late growth spurt. I encouraged her to take out loans and keep taking classes. By the end of the semester, she seemed determined to do just that. But I lost touch with her after the class ended. I hope she's doing well. Edit for info, since some responses were deleted. I also advised her to stay away from alcohol. She told me she was deathly allergic to it. I have no idea if that's true or if her parents just told her some nonsense, but I thought it was best not to make her question it.
In high school, I volunteered with the camera for the public access station in my small town. We filmed high school sports and various events. The guy who ran the station was an old New Yorker with a strong accent. He told us about living in Greenwich Village, hanging out with Bob Dylan and Seeger. He said he was the guy who reported all the folk singers to the government for being communists. After that, he moved to a small town in Utah to escape his past. I didn't take him seriously at the time, but years later I looked him up on the internet and confirmed his crazy stories were true. I worked with a guy in the 2000s. He was just a tall, quiet, nice guy, and we would sometimes chat about local teams and such. One day he came in with a black eye and said it happened at his other job. I didn't ask. Later I found out he was a part-time professional wrestler, and it was due to a punch that landed wrong. He played an old-school villain, and his character in the ring was so far from him that you had to laugh. My son and I used to go to the shows and have a blast. And well, friends, that was all for today's video. If you enjoyed it, let me know with a thumbs up so that YouTube can share these stories with more people. Remember to hit the bell icon to be the first to know when we upload a new video. See you next time.